You are on fire today. Did you drink a Red Bull before this?
I actually literally did have a Red Bull. Very
Okay.
on brand.
Hello and welcome to the 538 Politics Podcast. I'm Galen Druk.
And I'm Nate Silver.
And this is Model Talk.
The last edition of Model Talk of the year or not?
At least the last pre-election edition of Model Talk. We might do one.
Oh, the post-mortem. Victory/shame lap.
Yeah. Which are you expecting?
I think there's a 85% probability of victory and a 15. I don't know. I mean, look, to kick things off here, there were some threads on Twitter today about, like, how do you judge these forecasts? And the answer is that you judge based on a large sample of forecasts. It's hard to say based on any one race, right? And so the best way to judge how we did or how other people did is to look on a race-by-race basis, and then to look at the overall outcome and see if the outcome was something that was kind of in the plausible universe of events as we described it. But, you know, we're issuing more than 500 forecasts. I think it's 506.
Including the governor's.
435 House. Granted, of those House races, 300 of the 435 are layups. But between the three chambers, because governor's not a chamber, right? The three realms, let's call them. There are something like 140 competitive-ish races, 140, 150. And so that's the best way to judge how someone did is, A, how many of them are right, but B, how well calibrated are they? Are the 20% chances happening 20% of the time? Are the 70% chances happening 70% of the time? Are the toss-ups really toss-ups? It gets complicated because there is obviously the risk of a correlated error where one party would beat its projections across the board in most of the close races. In fact, that's very normal. That's what usually happens. It's part of why Democrats still have a shot, albeit a long shot in the Senate, is because you could have all these races systematically go better than they expect.
Well, you jumped right into the bulk of the questions that I had at the top of the show, at least. So let's take a moment and just lay out what all the forecasts show, and then we'll dig a little deeper into how to judge the performance of the forecast. So, which version of the forecast should we be using right now, or which do you feel most comfortable with? And that's what I'll
They all have
read.
different purposes.
They all have different purposes, so we should consider all of them. For our purposes right now, I guess I'll say, according to the classic forecast, in the House, Democrats have an 85% chance of winning.
Oh, we gotten rid of the fractions? We decided
a 6 and 7 chance. In the Senate, it is the reverse. We give Republicans an 85% chance of keeping their majority in the Senate. And again, that's a 6 and 7 chance. And then we'll include governors as well. We project that 197 million Americans will be governed by Democratic governors. Of course, many of the gubernatorial toss-ups that we've discussed in the past are still toss-ups: Ohio, Wisconsin, Georgia, Nevada. So now that we have that out of the way, are there any changes that you want to talk about at the top?
No, it's really been very steady. I mean, it's been like, basically, if you want to describe the trajectory of the House model, which we launched in August, right? In August, there were initially good indications for Democrats, such as the generic ballot in particular. Presidential approval was low. Initially, they already did have an advantage in raising money, although not as profound as it became later on, right? So initially, we had them at launch at about a 75% chance, 70-75, bounced around there for a while. After Labor Day, we started to get in a lot more district-by-district polling. That data was generally very positive for Democrats, and it indicated that this national environment that you might expect to be pretty good was looking good on a race-by-race basis. The fact is that Democrats are ahead in national indicators by margins that are large enough that would translate, we would think, in a macro way to probably a Democratic House. And if you go race-by-race, it looks equally good for Democrats. I don't want to say better, I don't want to say worse, but I think they're highly consistent, the kind of micro and the macro indicators in the House. And they haven't changed that much, and I don't think they will change that much. I mean, we'll see. We're going to get the last set of generic ballot polls in from probably our colleagues at ABC and NBC and CBS. Maybe Gallup will find the ability to actually issue a generic ballot poll for once in its darn life, right? But you get these final high-quality, influential generic ballot polls, and if they all come in way different than our average, right, if they're all down at quote-unquote only a 6-point lead for Democrats, then our model will hedge on the House a little bit more. If it gets up to like a 10-point lead, and some of the better pollsters have shown double-digit numbers for Democrats occasionally, then it'll dip up a bit. But I think we're kind of in this zone. I should say, though, whereas in the Senate, all versions of our forecasts are the same, in the House, there are differences that I would consider to be interesting and meaningful. So I guess it's not that different, right? Because Light has 37 seats and Classic has 38. But Light accounts for greater uncertainty, too. Because saying if you just look at polls and you can't look at other indicators, and we don't know as much. So we have a really wide range in Light from 15 seats to 61, and that translates to almost a 25% chance, 23% that Republicans wind up on the happy for them end of the range. Classic says we have more information, and in particular we have data on fundraising, and that looks really good for Democrats, and so we see a consensus of indicators. Deluxe accounts for forecasts made by Cook Political and stuff. I think where the forecasters like Cook, etc., are most different from the algorithms is that they are more skeptical that there's really this really wide range of prospects beyond, say, a universe of 45 or 50 or 55. But yeah, we're basically talking about like a case where there are big tails, and it's not just philosophically. We're not just, believe me, I don't sit there and say, oh, let's pump additional uncertainty like Botox into the model, right? What we're saying is that because the playing field is so large, around 100 seats, that small errors are going to have twice the effect they might have had in a normal election. And so people's ranges should be twice as wide. I mean, we kind of encountered this in 2010, where I spent like a lot of time in 2010 saying, yeah, the range is wider than people think. And that year we actually wound up fairly close. It was, I think, 63. I think our model had it like 55 or something. But if we're within 8 of whatever our median is, if we're in 8 of 38, then that would be pretty good. A lot of the time, I think majority of the time, in fact, we're going to be more than 8 seats away, which is why you have to think of this as a range.
Okay, so let's dig a little bit deeper into assessing the performance of the model, which you already mentioned at the top, and you again started mentioning there. And we're going to go off of listener questions because we got plenty of listener questions about the performance of the model. First off, Matthew asks, how will Nate and team assess the performance of the model? Since, after all the low probability outcomes could occur, but that in itself would not be evidence against the model.
This is going to sound a little bit arrogant. So
for a change.
For a change. We're short on sleep. I don't have time. No, okay. I don't think it's supposed to sound arrogant. Look, I hope it doesn't sound arrogant, actually. What's critical to remember is that 538's models now have a long track record. This is if you want to count midterms, which obviously you should, this is like the 6th general election cycle. We've also issued forecasts in primaries in several cycles, right? And so there are a lot of elections that we forecast. I think we've issued, counting this year, like well over 1,000 election forecasts now. And so to some extent, the philosophical questions about election forecasting aren't that interesting because it's worked. It's worked in the sense that, number one, we give you honest probabilities, so a 20% chance is a real 20% chance. And number two, it's right most of the time. I don't think we've tallied up exactly how many are right, but I'm sure if you count all the layups, then it's well over 90%. But you judge it in the context of the overall track record.
So that would mean adding up each individual House race, Senate race, presidential race over the past 10 years and coming to some kind of conclusion about how accurate our forecasts have been.
Well, within this year, you should probably look at, out of your forecasts that are in the 20 to 30% bucket, let's say we have 50 of those, right? How many of those are won by the underdog? And it should be,
20 to 30%.
20 to 30% or so, right? And obviously you get into small samples and you slice and dice a sample too much, and you're going to have random error occur. But in fact, this is a better opportunity in some ways if you're forecasting the House to see what works and what doesn't work, because you actually do get a reasonably large sample of races. You get, again, of the 435, not all are interesting, but a good 120 or so are interesting and sometimes differ from other methods of forecasting. And so, in some ways, this is like a cleaner test than the presidency, where it's just really one race, right? For that matter, the presidential primaries are a cleaner test, right? Because you have one state at a time than the general election. I'm not saying this in a way that disadvantages us, right? I think our probably strongest track record is actually in presidential general elections. If you're saying where have we done the best overall? But I'm just saying in some ways that's the hardest one to judge, whereas this is an easier one to judge. But you should look at, the two top line numbers, Republicans with an 85 or whatever percent chance of taking the Senate, and Democrats with depending which version of the model, 80-ish% chance of taking the House. Those are just 2 of 508 forecasts that we issue. And they are the most important, to be sure. But judging a set of 500 forecasts is going to lead you more fruitful territory than judging 2.
So you would encourage people who want to judge the performance of 538's forecast to look at 508 races, not
Certainly,
just the top line forecast.
I mean, the top line's important, right? I mean, there's also the question of, like, if you're right or wrong, are you right or wrong for the right reasons, right? You know, again, I still don't know if people consider our 2016 presidential forecast right or wrong. Probably some of both. In this audience, at least, there's probably some who think it was right? But, like, the reason
out there
why,
on the streets,
I
think it's still wrong.
In hipster coffee shops. But the reason why, relative to other models, it gave Trump a better chance is because, number one, it knew that polling errors are correlated, meaning he does better in Wisconsin. He's also going to do better in Michigan. And number two, that the Electoral College was not favorable to Clinton. If you look at the Midwest, that Trump was overperforming there. And so, like, to the extent our model has a hypothesis this year that differs from the consensus, it's a little hard to tell, actually. I think probably, for better or worse, the convention of wisdom is boringly well aligned with, you know, but, like, I do think that it thinks that people are sleeping a little bit on the breadth of Republican problems, in part because of Democratic fundraising. That the playing field is larger than it used to be, that the races that are considered lean Republican are closer to what people might usually have thought of as toss-ups, that the races people think of as likely Republican are closer to what people might have thought of as lean Republican, where they're probably going to win, but it doesn't take that much to go wrong for a candidate to be asleep at the wheel and the Democrat wins instead. So it is a little bit on that tail. Like, I think, you know, what outcome would be most right would prove our model the most right would be if Democrats won, like, 47 seats or something, because even though, like, that's not what we think the most likely outcome is. We think the most likely outcome is in the 30s. I think that's where we probably have higher than the consensus where our model would be. You know, there's a 25-ish% chance of a 45-plus gain for Democrats.
You are on fire today. Did you drink a Red Bull before this?
I actually literally did have a Red Bull. Very
Okay.
on brand.
A follow-up question to that, and then we'll move on, is how will you judge which version of the forecast was better? So between light, classic, and deluxe, perhaps it's the same way that you would judge all of the races overall. But what's your answer? I
mean, that's more straightforward, right? You kind of look and say which ones were better calibrated, which ones were closer on average. Because you can also look at, like, how far are you off? Like, one thing I think people don't realize is, like, if Democrats win 21 seats, which is 2 fewer than they need to take the House, right? That's well within the fat part of our range. If Democrats lose 7 seats, that's not something our forecast says is plausible or really
At
even
all,
possible,
it's like
right?
less than 0.1%
you know, we'd say it's probably 1,001 shot, right? So in that event, I mean, not even that. In that event, then we'd say, okay,
we're packing. We're packing.
Well,
we're packing
I mean,
up.
that would mean that, like, and there are things, you know, if Democrats win the Senate but don't win the House, then that would mean that, like, to some extent, look, there is art and science in how you translate polls and their data into a model, and there's some disagreement. But if you have an outcome like one of those outcomes, then it's like, okay, polling is so far off that maybe we have to find some other way of forecasting elections.
Okay, I have a question that I know might trigger you. But
God.
Are you worried at all that if Democrats don't win the House, and I think this is a bigger risk. I think if Democrats win the House and also win the Senate, a lot of our listeners who seem to be Democrats are just going to be like, oh, okay, whatever. The 15% chance thing happened, but it was the thing that I wanted, so, you know, I'll cut them a break. But if Democrats don't win the House after Democrats were upset and blamed the polls in 2016, are you worried about what that could mean for people's faith in polls, faith in forecasting?
I don't really give a fuck because I can't do anything about it. I make the best forecast that I can, and I think this is the best forecast. You know, if I were purely concerned about hedging my reputation, then I'd say, oh, okay, well, it's actually a 35% chance. But that's exactly what we don't want from 538, right? We build these models in the summer when we don't know what they're going to say, right? And then we plug in the data, and it says what it says, right? We build the models based on what we think is the best and most responsible way to build a forecast. And we don't want to be influenced by, like, sentiment. You know what I mean? So it's like, I mean, look, we're not in the realm anyway where it's like that unlikely. We're saying it's between a 15 and a 25% chance, depending on which version of the model you look at, that the GOP keeps the House. Those are common everyday occurrences. And again, if they do it by just a few seats, that's pretty in line with empirically how accurate polls are, right? If polls are spot on, Democrats will win the House, but they don't have to be off by that much for Republicans to win. So I can't do anything. You know, I mean, I think, like, if you want to be honest, I think the incentives are for people to, because of 2016, hedge a little bit more than they should, maybe. I mean, I don't know. People hate making the same mistake twice.
Yeah, I've heard that from social media and watching commentators on TV, people are like, oh, well, we don't trust polls after 2016, so we really don't know. Let's treat this like a 50-50 chance that Democrats will take the House. I don't think you're wrong, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, look, in some way, again,
hedging.
It used to be that, I think I've said this on this podcast before, it used to be that every election was covered by the media as either a sure thing, so 100-0, or 50-50, we can't make any inferences at all, right? So we're in this zone where we're in the in-between zone, where most elections wind up, right? And I wouldn't say it literally has to be 50 or 100, right? But like anywhere between 60% and 95%, then you're trying to communicate both the fact that one side is favored and the fact that this is not what we think of as a sure thing. The traditional margin of error in a poll represents a 95% confidence interval. Probably not a bad standard, right? That like, don't treat things as a foregone conclusion if the chances are not above 95%. You know, if it is above 95%, then you get into journalistically, I think, some questions about like, is this the best way for us to be spending resources, right? I did a TV hit the other week with a TV station in Syracuse, and they want to talk about the Cuomo governor's race here in New York, and we have Cuomo as a 99-something% chance favorite, and like, you know, and they were kind of pressing me, well, can't polls be wrong? Yeah, but they can't be wrong by 25 points. It doesn't really happen, and he has so much freaking money, right? And it's a Democratic state and a Democratic year, and he plays to, you know, decimate his opponents. And so it's like, so at that point, if you're above 95%, then there becomes a question of like, is it responsible not to convey the likelihood? But like, look, if you're really detail-oriented, then you can probably detect that there is some subtle disagreement where it seems like, you know, we think this is a 80-ish% chance, and other people might think it's a 70-ish% chance. But in terms of conveying an overall message, then it's correct to say that it's uncertain until you get up to the high 90s, I think.
Okay, well, let's leave that there, and we are going to answer some more listener questions. But before we do that, today's podcast is brought to you by WeWork. WeWork understands that as companies grow, they want a space to call their own, one that provides the privacy and autonomy to build their own company culture, but without the commitment of a long-term traditional lease. That's where HQ by WeWork comes in. It's their newest product, and it gives companies access to the superior WeWork design, services, and flexibility, but in a completely private environment without the hassle of renting or operating your own office. And here's why this is so key. When you think about space, are you taking into account the full cost of operations and amenities? WeWork pricing incorporates everything you need to keep your business running, including HVAC, Wi-Fi, AV printing, package handling, cleaning, and security, all of the things that you need, but you don't really think about when you're starting a new business. So visit WeWork.com to find a location near you today to get started. All right, it is time for some more listener questions, and we're going to begin with Taylor, who asks, it seems like we assume that the polls have equal probability of being off in either direction. Can we use non-polling fundamentals to determine which direction the polls are more likely to be off in?
Yeah, no, I guess there is that ambiguity, right? I mean, because on the one hand, like the light version of the model assumes that, yeah, there's equally likely to be a polling error in either direction. You know, fundamentals say maybe that isn't true, right? That maybe if you're in a really Democratic district that the polls show a close race, the poll is more likely to underestimate Democrats. But like at least on a systematic level, that's a core assumption is that the polling error can run in either direction. You know, and kind of anecdotally, you know, the polling error doesn't always happen in the direction people expect. I mean, I think in 2017, the governor's race in Virginia, polls show the Democrat up 3 or 4 points, Northam, and then he won by 9 points, right? Even though a lot of people were like, oh my gosh, it's a toss-up, and we don't know anything about polling anymore. It's a toss-up. It's a toss-up. It's a toss-up.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay, so the answer is...
So basically, in some ways, the answer is both, right? Philosophically, the idea is that over the long run, the poll error is equally likely to go in another direction. But if you are adding fundamentals, then you are, in a sense, saying that, like, okay, we can kind of sort of predict the direction in which way the polling error might go.
And in this cycle, it would be in the direction of Democrats because of the fundamentals, including fundraising and special elections and things like that.
Correct.
Okay. Yusuf asks, could you estimate the generic ballot margin Democrats would need to put the Senate into toss-up range?
Well, the generic ballot's an input, not an output, but it's high. It's like 11 points or something, I think, when I looked at that. It's high. You need a pretty big... Although, actually, you know, if the generic ballot is at 8.5, I think double digits kind of scare everyone, including me, right? But just as there's a chance that Democrats only win the popular vote by 5 points, in which case, House really close, right? The other side of that would be winning by 11 or 12 points, and that's about the point at which the Senate becomes toss-up-like.
Sort of a follow-up on that. Toke from Denmark, I'm sorry, maybe that's not how you pronounce your name. It's either Toke or Toke from Denmark, says, I've noticed an interesting difference between the light and classic versions of the House forecast. In the classic version, Democrats are projected to win a majority if the popular vote margin exceeds 5.5 points, whereas in the light version, they would have to exceed about 7 points. He says, I fail to see the logic reason behind this difference. I hope that you can contribute with an explanation.
Is there no logic in Denmark?
So
I don't know what I'm supposed to be proving.
So why do the two forecasts view differently the popular vote margin needed in order to be favored?
The short answer is the light model expects Democrats to really overperform in heavily blue areas where they're Democratic incumbents. And so therefore it expects Democrats to pile on a bunch of popular vote in those districts, in the district we're taping this in New York, for example. And that means that, therefore there'll be additional juice in the popular vote number for Democrats that doesn't really help them in swing districts at all.
That makes sense.
But remember, we aren't actually, I don't want to blame the questioner, but in some ways, don't get it backward. We don't say, okay, here we have 8 points worth of popular vote to allocate, and here's how we do it. That's not how it works in the model, right? Instead, the model adds up its forecast of every individual race, and then it can spit out a popular vote estimate, right? But there's not I don't think it's correct to think of Democrats are going to waste votes. I mean, Democrats will waste a lot of votes in the sense that they have to win by 5 or 6 or 7 to be favored to win the House, right? And that's, that's a challenge.
Right. We do not estimate what the popular vote margin will be and then go and forecast the House races. It's the reverse.
Right. Which, confusingly, our presidential model actually kind of does estimate what the popular vote would be and then go, but not the House and the Senate models.
Okay. There we go. Our next question is from Seth, and he asks, if a time traveler could tell you that Democrats win 39 seats in the House, but no other information, would that change the Senate odds?
Yeah. I mean, it would mean that it would be very difficult for Democrats to take the Senate, because I don't think 39 is what results if conditions are in line with, they're just a teeny bit better than expectations. And I think they have to be a lot better than expectations for Democrats to win the Senate.
Okay, we got a lot of hypothetical questions this round. I think people are starting to, get anxious, look into the data a little bit more. Our next question is, what are the percentage odds that the Democrats retake the House if they lose the Kentucky 6th race, the results of which should be clear by around 8:30 p.m. Eastern?
I think they'd still probably be favorites.
So that won't necessarily tell us all that much.
It'll tell us something. I mean, we're trying to figure that out. I'm still kind of tweaking the election night model, right? I mean, the thing is, that's not going to occur in a vacuum. I mean, it depends on how much she would lose it by, too, right? If she lost it by, 10 points or something, then that might be enough, right? If she lost it by 1 point, that wouldn't really tell us anything, because that's where our forecast has it. I mean, where do we have that race, actually? We have it as a pure toss-up. So, not a bad indication, but, winning or losing a toss-up by 2 points wouldn't tell you that much. If there's a big blowout in either direction, it would. Keep in mind, though, we're going to have data in from quite a few races, from Virginia, from Florida. People won't call Florida until 8 p.m. or whatever, because parts of the Panhandle isn't closed. But you'll begin, we believe, to have vote count in Florida starting at 7 in a lot of districts there, right?
So there are other earlier indicators that will have helped us get an understanding of the night before 8:30.
Yeah, Virginia, one of the New Hampshire districts is competitive, and they usually begin to report some vote at 7, although some polling locations in New Hampshire are open until 8. So, we'll also have the Senate to look at, where Joe Donnelly's race in Indiana, again, Indiana is split between time zones, but traditionally you will begin to see vote count reported at 6. So if Donnelly, although there aren't a lot of Democratic incumbents in the House, to be fair, so it's a little bit different, but if Donnelly is having a good or bad night, then that will be an interesting early indication, not just of the Senate, but of the House in terms of where the overall environment is. People should be a little bit more cautious about making those inferences than they are in presidential races, right? Clearly by 8:30 in 2016, you could tell that Clinton was underperforming in at least the Midwestern swing states, right? This is a little bit more race-to-race dynamics. If Andy Barr, the Republican in Kentucky 6, made a huge advertising buy because GOP really wanted to hold that seat, right, and winds up winning by 5, it's not a great indication for Democrats, but it's, there are 435 different races, and they're more different. Well, they're more different than they are alike. I mean, they are correlated, but on the spectrum between perfectly correlated and perfectly independent. It's actually about 75% of the way to independent, whereas for presidential elections, it's like 60% of the way toward correlated. I know that's a very technical way of putting it, right? But and we spent a lot of time in 2016 telling people, hey, these errors are correlated. Trump wins one of the Midwestern swing states, he'll probably win them all, right? This is less of that, actually, and so people should be a little bit more cautious.
All right, that's an interesting way to put it. And I'll also say that next week we will be putting out a guide in this podcast feed to help people make sense of the night as we go on. So look for that next week. We have one more question before we move to rapid fire. It's a bit of an odd question, but we do get people asking about this from time to time, so I'll just let you answer it as you wish. Booker asks, do you think the model would ever be able to detect election tampering?
Maybe. I mean, I think there are probably more direct ways to do it, but, I guess could you have a set of results that were so weird in a certain area or a certain state? It would not be the first thing you'd look at, and it would not be the last thing you'd look at. It could be one of a number of diagnostic tools you could look at along with reporting about that.
Now we are moving to rapid fire. We'll give as brief responses as we can. First off, Jack asks, are more or fewer polls being conducted in this midterm cycle versus the last?
I believe it's up in the House for 2014. I think maybe down in the Senate. I think probably down in the Senate. I mean, we have seen pollsters like Siena/Upshot and Monmouth pay more attention to the House, a decision that I think is probably correct, but we've undershot on some of these Senate races, even not just necessarily the Montanas and the West Virginias, but Missouri, I don't really have a great sense for what's going on. Apart from Texas and Florida have been extremely well polled, right? And Arizona's been pretty well polled. Apart from that, almost all these races you could use a little bit more polling.
And the next question we've answered before on Model Talk, but it keeps coming up, so let's answer it again. Do coattails from a popular governor or senator affect the House model?
No, and maybe they should. If you're making a long list of reasons why each party might beat its forecast, one that would make me a little bit nervous about Republicans is the fact that you have New York, Illinois, Pennsylvania, California, those four. You have top-of-the-ticket races that are not expected to be competitive, where you'll have, if polls are right, Democratic landslides in those states for governor and for Senate, if they have Senate races. In fact, there isn't a Republican in the Senate race in California. That would make me nervous if I were a Republican, because we have a lot of, districts in New York, for example, that we have as lean Republican. A lot of the upstate districts are, or as well as Long Island, right? They're districts where close, Democrats not quite ahead in the polls, right? But they're toss-up or lean Republican or maybe likely Republican like Peter King's district. That would make me nervous, is that Cuomo will turn people out. The Republican GOP candidate is weak for governor and that would make me nervous, I would think. But we don't account for that in the model.
All right, next question. How do you make projections for district-by-district turnout?
So we look at how competitive the race is. We look at how many people voted in previous elections there. I believe in the Senate we look at how much money has been spent, and generally if more money is being spent, that's an indication of higher turnout. We look at population growth, so all our population estimates are contemporary up to 2018. We look at how many minorities there are. In general, there's more drop-off in turnout in states and districts with a lot of minority, Black and Hispanic voters at the midterms, then they rebound in presidential years. But we're forecasting a very high overall turnout.
Next question. Tom asks, does the model incorporate betting odds from sites like PredictIt, and if not, why?
Because they're dumb. No, because then it would just regurgitate, it would be eating its own tail, and I don't know. I think the betting markets are kind of dumb this year. I think there's not enough money in them to there was some site that was offering a 15-20% chance that Elizabeth Warren would lose her Senate race, which is insane to the point of being discrediting about whether who is making these bets, right? That's a crazy number to.
Did you buy?
I think ethically I'm not allowed to.
Fair enough.
But there are good buys, right? If there's still whatever stupid bookie site is offering that Elizabeth Warren contract, then that's a pretty good way to safely invest your money. I think she's probably 99 or 999 out of 1,000 or something to keep her Senate seat.
Next question. Is doing your own polls something that has ever been discussed or thought about at the site?
Not really. I mean, we have sometimes partnered with SurveyMonkey and other polling agencies, right? But I think we like being at arm's length from from doing our own polls. In a sense, I think it's not a coincidence that when the Upshot began doing a lot of their own polls, they didn't issue their own I mean, it's a little bit weird, right? Because you're kind of like, is a poll a forecast? Well, kind of, right? You're going to take your poll and then plug it into your forecast. It just gets very weird in terms of...
You don't want to where you eat, as they say.
That is not the phrase that I would use, but there's a little bit, if one were to use that phraseology to describe it, I don't think that would be wrong necessarily.
All right, here's another one. This is kind of fun. When Nate Silver wants to check what the model says, does he have his own version that he looks at, or does he just check the website like everyone else? I
mean, I do have a version running on my laptop that can run. However, it's slow. Running 435 separate races, and actually it runs governor and House too, so 506 or whatever. To take 50,000 simulations of those would take me a long time on my laptop. And so therefore it's done on servers where you have essentially multiple instances of the program running at once. Even that takes 25 minutes or so now.
And so the answer is you check the website like everyone else.
Check the website like everyone else, yeah.
Okay, second to last question.
Penultimate.
Chris asks, I've been seeing 538 mentioned in political ads I've come across on Facebook. Any reaction to that?
I mean, we'd rather people didn't do it. I hope if they do it, they cite us accurately. I mean, I don't know what, one thing we've seen a lot of Democratic candidates cite is our Trump score, which is so-and-so has voted with Trump 90X% of the time, usually. Mm-hmm. I think it was Mike Kaufman, the Republican candidate in Colorado, who was complaining about how we were a blog and how we cherry-picked the votes that we look at. I'm going to tell you, Mike Kaufman, that's BS. That's fake news. We look at every measure that the president has expressed a position on, and we look at how you voted on every measure. You can cherry pick yourself if you want and say, well, on key votes, like on healthcare, for example, then maybe I vote against the president, right? But we're not cherry picking anything, and so you're lying to your constituents when you make that claim.
All right.
Come at me, Mike Kaufman.
Nate on Red Bull, not someone you want to mess with.
No, but he is an indication of there are lots of reasons why the GOP is in trouble in the House, but one reason is that it used to be you would have members. Let me check the Trump score on Kaufman just so I make sure that I'm saying that accurately. So Kaufman, he has a 96% Trump score, and he can go and see there are dozens and dozens of votes collected here, and he very rarely votes against the president. It used to be that if you were a moderate in a swing district, you would very often break with your party, right? He's in a district that Clinton won by 9 points. And the fact is that, he's probably going to lose, and he's probably going to lose in part because the president is unpopular, at least in his district, and he voted with the president 96% of the time over dozens of votes. He didn't have to do that. He probably felt pressure from his caucus. I know he took one or two big symbolic votes where he didn't vote that way, but it's absolutely accurate to say he almost always backs the president's position, and that's probably a reason why he's down in the polls.
All right. And that brings us to our final question for our final model talk pre-election. And hopefully this will give us a chance to shout out some of our colleagues at 538. John asks, how is the data for the models collected?
So we have people who just kind of literally spend all day
and night
looking at polls and setting up various Twitter alerts and Google News alerts and other indications of when polls pop up. People sometimes send polls to us, and so that whole crew is pretty amazing. Derek and Dustin, sometimes Nathaniel Rakich will do it. Andrea Jones-Rui has done it at some points in the past. Drew Mill has done it. You don't know who these people are necessarily, but that's actually a very hard job, is to find all the polls. There are more decisions than you would have to think now about which polls to include, but about okay, the number in the write-up says the Democrats are ahead by 5, but in the crosstabs it says she's up by 3, right? What's going on here is you have to go and contact the pollster. Pollsters won't issue enough detail. By the way, if you work for, I'm
not going to stop you. Go ahead, whatever you're doing.
There's some, hold on, let me find this. Let me find, where is this exactly? So every year at the end of the race, or not every year, but in 2016, something called the Auto Alliance puts out a bunch of polls that they do. They used to do it with Rasmussen Reports. Now they do it with Harris X, which is another online pollster. Let me go and make sure I'm correctly accusing the right person. It's the Auto Alliance / National Retail Federation polls. They're very bad about disclosing how the polls are done, and they're very bad at asking questions. So if you work for the Auto Alliance or the National Retail Foundation, please answer your phone and email when a 538 person goes ahead and asks you to provide basic details about how these polls were conducted. you are not doing a good job of representing your industry if, like, you are embarrassingly not actually listing any detail about how many people were in the poll, for example. If you erase the previous poll every time you conduct a new poll, so there's no way to actually track what you've been doing. So Auto Alliance / National Retail Federation, get your shit in order.
See, you guys, this is what happens when not enough people argue with Nate about his model. He has to go picking fights
Mike Kaufman.
with just random politicians and pollsters or retail groups or whatever.
I'm not going to buy anything.
What?
I'm going to boycott the National Retail Foundation by not buying anything or not going in any cars until... I'm just kidding.
Good luck with that. All right, Nate, that's a wrap.
Okay.
How do you feel? 4 days left.
I still got a lot of work to do, TBH.
Well, we'll let you get to it. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
We will probably have one more model talk of the season to recap how the model did, and then we won't have a model until, I guess, are we going to do a model for the 2020 primaries?
We'll try. I hate I love the primaries like a news story. They're my favorite elections to cover as a news story.
Parties just totally destroying themselves.
Oh, they're so much fun.
But
yeah.
So maybe we'll have a model. We'll see. I'm Galen Druk. Tony Chow is in the control room. Send us your post-election day questions for our next model talk. Also, definitely tune in to 538.com on election day. We will be live blogging all day and all night. Then we will have a podcast response that evening. We'll have analysis, podcasts, lots of content for you throughout the week. So come hang out with us at 538. That's what we're here for. If you have any questions, you can email us at podcasts@538.com or get in touch with us on Twitter. Also, go rate us on the Apple Podcast Store. We're out here killing ourselves. Podcasts every day. Tell us what you think about the show. That is it from us. We will see you on Monday.